All right, in this subunit, we're going to discuss the excuse of frustration of purpose. All right, in this unit, we're discussing excuses. We've already discussed the excuse of mistake, mutual mistake, and unilateral mistake. We just finished discussing the excuses of impossibility and impracticability. Now, let's talk about the excuse of frustration of purpose. All right, so the situations that implicate the excuse of frustration of purpose still involve some sort of supervening event that was beyond the control of the parties. But the supervening event does not cause the performance of the party claiming the excuse to be either impossible or impracticable. Basically, she's just saying, because of this supervening event, I no longer need this contract. Normally, the party claiming the excuse of frustration of purpose, her performance under the contract is the payment of money. And the supervening event did not cause the payment of money to be impossible. Naturally, the payment of money is never considered impossible, even if you don't have money, right? Otherwise, contractual obligations would be so watered down. And it doesn't cause her payment of money to be more costly. It doesn't cause it to be impracticable either. What she is saying is that I don't want to pay because the supervening event made it so that I don't need this contract anymore. Let's look at an example. All right, let's get a better grip on what type of fact patterns implicate frustration of purpose by looking at an example, two variations of the same fact pattern. In our first variation, owner contracts to lease the theater. A theater owner contracts to lease a theater to a magician for a week. A fire at the theater caused by a lightning strike, and it's a lightning strike, so I can say that it's out of the control of the theater owner. The fire at the theater either destroys the theater or damages it severely. Here's our second variation of the same fact pattern. A magician contracts to lease a theater from the owner for a week. A fire at the storage facility where the magician keeps her equipment destroys all of her equipment. All right, so now we have these two fact patterns. The question is, which fact pattern implicates the excuse of frustration of purpose, and which fact pattern implicates the excuse of impossibility or impracticability? Well, let's look at the first fact pattern. In this case, the theater owner wants out of the contract. Why? Because her performance has become impossible or impracticable. The theater, if it's been destroyed, her performance is impossible. If it's damaged so severely, then her performance is impracticable. Now, what about the second fact pattern? Well, the second fact pattern doesn't implicate the doctrine of impossibility or impracticability. It implicates the fact pattern, it implicates the excuse of frustration of purpose. Why? Well, first, let's ask ourselves, has magician's performance under the contract become impossible or impracticable? It all depends on how you look at her performance under the contract. Now, often students will say, well, yes, her performance has become impossible. Her performance under the contract is to do magic on stage, and her equipment has been destroyed, so she cannot. It is impossible for her to do her magic on stage. But let's look at the contract. What is her promised performance under the contract? Well, in her contract to lease the theater from the theater owner, the magician is promising to pay the theater owner. Therefore, her performance is payment. Has the fire made payment impossible or impracticable? No, it hasn't. She can still pay for the use of the theater. what has happened because of the supervening event, the fire? Her equipment was destroyed, and so her purpose for leasing the theater has been frustrated. All right, let's take a look at the rule. Now, most of these elements you're familiar with, so I'm just going to read through it. A party's performance is discharged if the principal purpose for her making the contract is substantially frustrated through no fault of her own by the occurrence of an event after the making of the contract, the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption on which the contract was made, unless the language or circumstances indicate to the contrary. All right, so most of these elements, if not all of them, you have seen when we talked about mutual mistake or impossibility and impracticability. So we're not going to go through all of these elements again. There is one that is particularly important to frustration of purpose, and it requires a slightly different analysis than we're used to. All right, let's explore why the element, a basic assumption, is so critical to our analysis of the frustration of purpose excuse. Let's look at a short hypothetical. So imagine I enter into a contract to rent a car. The reason I am renting this car is to go to a business meeting in a city about an hour's drive away. Sometime before I am scheduled to pick up the car and drive to my meeting, the meeting is canceled. Naturally, I don't need the car anymore, so I would like to get out of my contract with the car rental company. I would like to avoid paying that money to them if I can. What's my best argument? Frustration of purpose is my best argument. It is my only argument, but it's still not a good argument. Why? Well, one of the elements of frustration of purpose is that the non-occurrence of the supervening event, in this case, the cancellation of the meeting, was a basic assumption of both parties. Here, the meeting was not a basic assumption for both parties. The car rental company did not know of the meeting. They did not care about the meeting. And therefore, the non-occurrence of the supervening event, the non-occurrence of the cancellation of the meeting, was not a basic assumption for the car rental company, even though it was a basic assumption for me. So what we're looking for in the frustration of purpose excuse, for a good argument that you should be excused because of the doctrine of frustration of purpose, is a shared purpose. Both parties have to have this purpose to the contract. I had a purpose of renting the car to go to the meeting. The car rental company did not share this purpose. Now, the parties don't have to share the purpose equally, but there has to be a shared purpose. All right, let's look at a famous case where the parties did share a purpose. This case involves an apartment in England. In England, an apartment is called a flat. And the flat owner says, whoa, we're going to have a coronation parade, and the coronation parade is going to go right by my flat, so I can make a little extra money by leasing out my flat so that someone can watch the coronation parade. So the flat owner puts out an ad saying, lease my flat so that you can see the coronation parade. Now, a tenant, and we'll call this party the tenant responds to the ad and said, yes, I would like to see the coronation parade and I would like to lease your flat. So the parties enter into a contract. Before the day of the coronation parade, the king gets ill and the coronation parade is canceled. The tenant naturally wants out of the contract. The tenant says, you know, I don't need this contract anymore. I don't want your flat for that day because there is going to be no parade. So the parties go to court. And at that time, there was no doctrine of frustration of purpose. There was only the doctrine of impossibility. in this case, the doctrine of impossibility turns into the doctrine of frustration of purpose. So this is the first frustration of purpose case as far as I know. Now, why is this a good case for frustration of purpose? In this case, the court did discharge tenant's duties under the contract because of, well, they said impossibility, but because of frustration of purpose. Why? Well, clearly the parties had a shared purpose. The non-occurrence of the cancellation of the parade was a basic assumption of both parties. In other words, both parties, when they entered into a contract, assumed there was going to be a parade. And then the later supervening event, the cancellation of the parade, frustrated the purpose of both parties. They shared a purpose. And that is why this was a good case for a successful argument of frustration of purpose. Right? The ad in this case shows a shared purpose between the parties.